Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
So with me today on the enemies list is Doug Sosnik. Doug is a longtime political strategist. He served President Bill Clinton in what we think of as the old days of peaceful bipartisan cooperation, which back then we thought it was the hottest of hot wars, and now we realize we were all living in a cozy dream. Doug, thank you so much for coming on the enemies list today.
Thank you, Rick. It's great to be here.
Well, I want to start out talking about the current climate in D.C. Because you're a longtime observer of this, and you've watched some of these dramas play out before. How do you think last week went in the shutdown politics of Washington, and Kevin McCarthy's the challenges that are facing McCarthy right now from the crazy wing of his party?
Yeah, well, first of all, I've been around a lot longer than you have. Just to give you a frame of reference, I ran a congressional race in 1981.
Okay, I was still in high school. I grant you.
Yep. And so I came to, the guy I worked for won. He beat the guy that had beaten him in 1980. So anyway, I came to Washington as a chief of staff in 1983. So my frame of reference goes back 40 years in terms of how do you view what's going on today. I think the what we see today is the sort of into 3 decades worth of trends that started in the early 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Newt Gingrich and the House Republicans in the mid 90s begot what we have today. In a sense, Matt Gaetz is a child of the Newt Gingrich era.
Sure.
"Quote unquote," burning down the house to save it. In terms of the activities last week, Mitch McConnell, I think, said it best, which is basically every time that Republicans have tried to shut the government down, it's not worked. It's not worked either from a policy standpoint or from a political standpoint. Mm-hmm. So, Clinton got reelected in '96 for a variety of reasons, but I would put one of the reasons at the top was the government shutdown that Gingrich and Dole, mostly was driven by Gingrich, and Dole was stuck being attached to Gingrich and had to go along.
Right.
They got nothing from a policy standpoint in terms of why they shut the government down. And it's like one of the factors, I think, that led to Clinton's reelection. And then in the middle of the second term of Obama, the Republicans shut the government down over Obamacare and got absolutely nothing for doing that. Now, they did pick up a lot of seats and took back the House in 2014,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think it was because of the government shutdown. I think it was because of a second term, midterm for a sitting president. And then lastly, of course, was Trump's shutdown in 2018 over additional funding for the wall. So they got no funding additional, and they ended up losing control of the House 2 years later. So I think this is a trend line, but I do think they've sort of Republicans have set sort of a new bottom, and I don't think the Democrats are going to bail them out. They're not committed to governing, and basically, clickbait and cable television has taken over the Republican Party. They're not a serious governing party anymore.
Oh, I think that's very much right, and that was actually one of my questions. In fact, we'll jump to that one now because you and I are both of an era where while there was plenty of spirited partisan competition and back and forth, there were still people who believed that jobs had to get done, things had to be done, responsible adults had to sit in a room and operate the levers of government for the American people. And as someone again who's observed this since the Reagan Revolution, basically, I'd love to get an outside Democratic perspective, because I have my feelings on how the Republican Party has mutated and changed. Tell me how vast the gulf is in your mind, how much the delta is that you can see from your career.
The delta between what and what?
Between Republican Party when you came to Washington and the Republican Party of today?
Well, listen, we've had a political realignment in America, and both parties are different now.
Sure.
I mean, you could charitably say that the Republicans have become a working class party, and their policy positions that they take are in line with that. I think the biggest problem, though, is our incentive system in our country and our politics.
Sure.
And elected officials may not show a lot of leadership, but they do understand how to survive in their jobs.
And they want that more than anything.
Right. And so the incentive system right now is for both the left and the right to be more concerned about losing a primary than a general election.
Mm-hmm.
When I started politics in the 1980s, by the mid 80s, over half the Republicans, over half the members in the Senate were of a different party than the presidential candidate who carried their state in the last presidential election. Now you only have 5.
Right.
You only have 23 congressional members of a different district than the candidate who carried their state in the last presidential election. So the political incentives really right now, what I call bad behavior from both the left and the right.
Mm-hmm.
And the Republicans have taken it to an extreme because essentially there is no party. It's all brand building. And it's all about getting on TV and getting press and generating, what's nice, what is a nice thing about politics is that the bundlers and the big money guys don't control anything anymore.
Right.
Which is good. The bad thing is that the money's in small donors, and the candidates from the left and the right that are able to energize the donors are the ones that take the most extreme positions within both parties.
Absolutely. And you see that negative incentive structure playing out because on the far right, you get people who say something outrageous. And when they get called on it, they run to Fox News and then they say on their email fundraising, did you see me on Fox News? They tried to cancel me, but I'm doing this and that. And there's a certain degree of that on the left to their baseline audience. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the role of mega donors now is fundamentally altered. I mean, you've got
I just say one thing, taken from more of a meta view, and as you hopefully can tell from this conversation, I'm not sort of part of the Hezbollah wing of the Democratic Party, and I do believe there's plenty to go around.
Sure,
but I think to understand I always tell people if you are trying to understand the 2024 tree, the election, you really can't understand that tree if you don't understand the forest. And these are really meta long-term trends that have created the situation that we're in our country. I tell people, if there's one thing I can leave you with, it's that Donald Trump did not create these problems in our country. He is a reflection of what was going on in our country. 100 years from now, when they're studying this period of time, they're not going to be focusing that much on Trump. They're going to be focusing on what was going on in America that enabled someone like Donald Trump to become president. And I believe that we had sort of an unwritten pact between the parties following World War II, which is as long as we had 2.5%, 3% GDP growth annually, which we did.
Yep.
That we basically agreed to not upset the apple cart, and then we could agree to disagree on whatever we wanted to disagree on, but after an election's over, we govern. But starting in the early 1970s, you really began to see with the changing of the economy, the beginning of the decline of the middle class in America, which is a 50-year decline,
right,
which culminated with a realignment in the parties during the 2016 presidential election, which was accelerated by the Trump presidency. And this created these enormous divisions in our country that transcended just a position on an issue. It was identity of who they are and which clan they're in and who they're against.
Yeah, the who you oppose now in politics is, and how far you're willing to be transgressive and ugly and always on the attack about your opponents is much more a product, I think, of the last 20 years. I think you're right, absolutely right. The middle class economic stressors that led to globalization and everything else, helped drive some of the polarization on the left and the right. But a lot of this also comes down to this sort of weird incentive structure of a pet media, which exists on both sides, but is more developed on the right of a media just willing to tell them everything they want to hear and reinforce their values and their perceptions. So what I wanted to get back to is when the Republicans played the impeachment games with Bill Clinton that they did, they paid a terrible political cost for it. Now they're playing the same thing with Joe Biden a second time around here, and on an even more flimsy and sort of loose basis. They paid a terrible price for it in the 98 window. What do you think the outcome of this current impeachment situation is going to be, both logistically for the impeachment itself and for the political impact of it on the Republicans and on the president?
Yeah, so I'll just take a step back. I mean, basically, I think essentially the country is at 45, 45, 10, 45 Democrat, 45 Republican. I can talk to you if you want a little bit about the Trump-Biden race and what the polling has been doing in a minute.
That was my next.
Okay, so anyway, so you essentially have, 45% of the country is what I call crazy right, and 45% is crazy left, and 10% thinks the right and the left are both crazy. And what we are going through this I don't want to go too high in the clouds here, but we're going through the biggest transition in our country since the late 1800s. We moved from an agrarian society to an industrial society. We're moving now, we have been for the last 50 years, away from a top-down manufacturing economy to a 21st century digital and global one.
Right.
So it takes 30 or 40 years. It's called a hinge moment. You think about a metal hinge on a door holding two pieces of wood together. So since the beginning of the century, in 10 out of the last 12 election cycles, the public has voted against whoever's in power. And so you've had at least a chamber of the House or the Senate or the president change parties 10 out of the last 12 elections. So they're voting against whoever's in power. And it's that 10% of the people that think both parties are crazy that are voting against whoever's in power, because we're in this transition, and our 20th century institutions, and I put politics and government at the top of that, are incapable of dealing with these 21st century problems.
That's right.
And so we saw this transition in the early 1900s. It took several decades, and we're going through that now.
So, and I think that transition is always a rough one. It's a rough one for people in politics who do want to try to draw like historical consistency across decades, because I think the amplitude and the frequency of changes in our society is getting more pronounced as we move into this.
Well, we're sorting through, after World War II, the way you made a fortune in America was sell to the middle class.
Sure.
Now, only a fool would sell to the middle class. They asked Willie Sutton why he robs banks. He said, well, that's where the money is. And so increasingly we're a have and have not society. And people are seeing it every single day. If you just think about when you travel, about if you have money, you go through a different security line. If you have money, you get on the plane first. Yep. If you have money, when you get off, you don't have to wait for your car. So every day, 10 times a day, the people who are on the short end of the stick here are reminded that there are two rules in this country. And that's what's driving so much of the resentment that Trump is tapping into.
Yeah, I mean, that going back to the 50-year slide in the middle class, I mean, we're now basically in the third generation of that set of stressors on the middle class aspirational economy that existed from the 1960s, where the promise of work hard, go to college, do well, you'll buy a house, you'll be able to have a house and kids and a family and a good life, doesn't work for anybody anymore.
Well, there's an overriding sense of one of two things about systems in America: big systems, big structures. One is they're either broken, or the other is they're corrupt. And I think that you're looking now at millennials and Gen Zs, who are the largest population group in America. They'll be the largest voting group by the end of the decade. Particularly younger millennials and all the Gen Zs. All they've seen in their adult life is going to war on a lie, the 2008 economic crises, No one went to jail. They saw what it did to their families. COVID has even made a bigger, I think, cleavage between people who have money and people who don't. You look at who has to go to work and who does remote work. So this is long festering alienation. And by the way, to be clear, while the last 4 elections, the younger generation has voted over 60% for Democrats, they're not Democrats. They just hate Republicans. They're not aligned with Democrats.
You know what? We just came out of the field with a big research piece at Lincoln Democracy, RC4, and that is something that really popped out in the numbers. Was these young people do not associate with the Democratic Party; they just hate the Republicans.
Right. And if you look at the polling done out of Harvard, I don't know if you've seen John Della Volpe's.
Yes, I've had John on the show. He's terrific.
Yeah. But there's more similarities than dissimilarities generationally on the Democratic side. But if you look at younger Republicans, 40 and younger, they don't have the same issues, concerns, or sets that the older. And so it's going to be a real page turner for the Republican Party when the generations flip.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the Republican Party had as a consistency for a long time was that there was a sort of internal education function for Republican voters and activists. And you grew up, as I did, at least in, the way I came up, is, you understood the three-legged stool of the party. You understood that, foreign policy, social conservatism, and economic liberty were these 3 big things, and people could articulate all of them. But that really has fallen apart for the younger generation of Republicans.
It's true. And I just add one thing. It's fairly rare on the Democratic side. I don't know about the Republican side, but I'm one of those guys that spent a lot of my life running campaigns.
Yep.
And I spent a lot of my life in government. And there's generally people don't split the two because the skill sets are different.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you, in government and trying to do the right thing it's a lot harder than campaigns. There's nothing easier in a campaign than just saying a bunch of crazy stuff and not having to pay any price for it and just figuring out how you win the cycle. Well, that's not how government works.
No, it is not. And I've been inside and outside. I've been inside government 3 times and outside the rest of my career. So probably 8 years of the last 35 inside government. Once at the federal level with Bush 41. Once at the state level in Florida, and once in New York as a senior advisor to the mayor for Rudy Giuliani when he was still somewhat semi-sane. And you're right, that is something I think that people really have undervalued, is that governance is hard work. It's a real job. It takes grown-up adults doing serious things to sustain it, and it doesn't just happen magically.
No, I think that's right. And ultimately, if you're an incumbent, if you're a chief executive, I mean, nobody knows what a congressman does. Nobody knows what a senator does.
Right.
But if you're running a city or running a state, running a country, ultimately, the single best way to get reelected as an incumbent as a chief executive is 2 things. One is do a good job of governing, and the other is do an effective job of communicating what you've done on behalf of the public.
That's right.
And we learned in '94 with Clinton that we thought we did a great job of governing, but we did a lousy job of explaining our story to people. And we paid a price for it in '94. And then we learned that it's not good enough to just do a good job. You also have to communicate, which I think was one of the reasons Reagan was so effective, because he did less than almost any president, but got more impact from it because he had a story to tell, and it held together.
I think that there's a sort of sneer about Reagan with a lot of people, but he understood intrinsically that storytelling and narrative were always going to be a political asset above and beyond saying, here's our 600-page plan about X. He could go out and tell a story about it. And I think that's something that Bill Clinton was very good at, and especially after '94, he got very good at that, sort of relating the things they were doing to people. And I think that
I'll tell you, Rick, 2 quick stories to reinforce your point. The first is, so a New York Times reporter was telling me the story that he was in the Reagan White House interviewing Mike Deaver,
Mm-hmm.
Right before the evening news. That's back in the days when the world stopped at 6:30 and you watched the evening news because that drove what the newspaper said the next day. So they sat in Reagan in Deaver's office. I think he was the deputy chief of staff at the time, and they ran this piece of Reagan, which was devastating piece in terms of what they were talking about and this or that. So when it was over, the reporter didn't know what to say. So he finally said, "Deaver, what'd you think of that?" And Deaver said, "That was spectacular." And the reporter said, "Well, I don't understand. What do you mean? Did you hear what they said?" And Deaver laughed and says, "Nobody listens to the words. All they do is look at the pictures. Those were spectacular pictures." The other story I'll tell you quickly was, so after the 94 midterms, after we'd done all the stuff we thought for the American public, and the Democrats had at the time, I think, the biggest rout in the midterm elections.
Yes, it was.
And since World War II, and lost the House of Representatives for the first time since the 1950s. We did focus groups in Iowa to figure out what was wrong. And so we played speeches of Clinton. And Clinton said, the old days, you got a job and you stayed in the company for forever and had the protection. And now the average person's going to change their job eight times in their lives. And so if you aren't really aggressive and don't do training and all that, you're really going to be in trouble. Well, after doing focus groups, we changed the speech to say, this is the greatest country in America. Your parents' generation, you got a job out of college. Your father got a job out of college and was locked into that job for the rest of his life. Well, now you're going to change your jobs 8 times. Now you have an unbelievable opportunity where sky is the limit on the advancement. But you have to work hard to be able to achieve this once in a lifetime opportunity. So the point is, the narrative matters and language matters.
Bill had a great speechwriter, a guy named David Kusnet, he wrote a little book called Speaking American. And it sits on one of my shelves near my desk. It is a ragged, dog-eared version. But that narrative turn that Clinton made, I think that was also one of the reasons he got through impeachment, paradoxically, because he kept telling American stories outside of his own. Well, listen, I want to ask you a little bit about how you see the landscape of the current race in this, with the aforementioned sort of 45-45-10 division in the country. How do you see the landscape right now for the Biden-Trump race to come?
So I would say that we're in the most stable, unstable political environment I've ever seen. And the reason why I say that is there's been a kind of a stability in our politics, as I mentioned earlier, and it really started in the 2016 presidential election, and then was on accelerant during and after the Trump presidency. There's an old saying that all politics is local, but that's no longer the case. Now all politics is national. And even though we have 340 million people, there are only a handful of states that matter in determining the outcome of a presidential election, and as well as control of the Senate. So national polls don't matter anymore. It's only really what's going on in probably most 6 states. We've had since the beginning of the century, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of stability of alienation towards whoever's in power with the 45-45-10. And so starting with, so I give presentations all the time, and I have to update the polling because I can't stand in front of a group of people and show them a 9-month-old poll.
Oh, no.
The fact of the matter is I could show them a 9-month-old poll, and it's just as timely as it is today. What happened was, starting in the summer of 2021, the honeymoon was over and the lines crossed with Biden. Whereas Trump never got 50% of the vote or 50% job approval one single time as president, Biden was getting between 56, 58% job approval until the summer of 21. And you had a series of events happen in the summer of 21, starting with him basically declaring victory over COVID on the South Lawn on the July 4th. And how we're all going to go back to normal on Labor Day. We had the Afghanistan withdrawal, which we're all quite familiar with, in August.
Yep.
Inflation in September rose above 6% for the first time and stayed that way for over a year. And we also had supply chain backups began in that September. So by early November, probably even by October, basically what's happened with Trump has happened with Biden. There's a range of between 40 and 48% that both Biden and Trump can get. In the case of Trump, when he was talking about the dirty little secret is a lot of Trump's policies were popular with the American public. And you'll see that on China and other issues, a lot of positions that Trump took, Biden has not actually changed very much because he knows they're popular. So when Trump was talking about the issues that people care about, which are more popular than you would think, he was getting around 48%. And when he was being goofy and creepy, then he'd get around 40%. And so in the case of Biden, we had a little 3 or 4 months ago uptick in consumer confidence. So he kind of edged up to 47, 48% favorable. Then things, gas prices have gone back up now, and he's down to around 40. So you're really in this range of this narrow band of these guys at around 45 or 46. Over 70% of the country now has said we're in the wrong track now for 2 years. And so if you take a step back and look at all the data, it's basically very stable. Now, what's interesting about a Trump-Biden rematch is the reason that Trump is skating his way through the primary is due to the support of the base of the party.
Sure.
He's also running a much more sophisticated campaign. It's quite different for Democrats. The reason Biden has been able to avoid a serious primary is because of the elites in the Democratic Party. So whereas it was a grassroots movement for Trump, it's been an elite movement for Biden. And remember, I would say, look, as much as I dislike Trump, and I gather you may dislike him more, if you put aside how contemptuous a person he is for a moment and just look at him as a political animal,
sure.
I don't think, he got elected president without a campaign. He didn't really have donors. He didn't even know what delegates were. He had no structure and organization. He took office owing fewer people than I think of any president ever elected. In the case of Biden,
that's right. I think that's right.
In the case of Biden, he's the first president since George H.W. Bush, who got elected in 1988, essentially for a Reagan third term. Biden is the first president since Bush in 88 to get elected without a political base. He doesn't have a political base. And if you look at both the exit polls of 2020, you look at the most recent NBC poll that just came out, the overwhelming reason that people give of why they're voting for Trump is because they're voting for Trump. If you look at the people who are voting for Biden, the majority of them are voting for Biden as a vote against Trump and not a vote for Biden. And in that same poll, they asked Democrats, who do you, basically a member of the Democratic Party, the Biden wing or somebody else.
Sure.
And the Warren Sanders vote was about the same number as Biden.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. I mean, it was really telling to me a couple of weeks ago when AOC and Bernie both endorsed Biden. And there was a sort of grumbling like, oh, they've sold out, they've gone. But I think you're right, though. It is an elite versus a sort of stochastic, noisy, weird base movement in a lot of ways.
And I'll tell you one thing, which I know for sure. We don't know each other. I know for sure you get this because I know for sure this is how you've done your life because I've seen it. I don't care about anything campaigns except three things. I want to define what the race is about.
Yep.
I want to define my candidate, and I want to define the other candidate. That's all I care about.
100%.
Now, if I were descending from a trip to the moon and came back in America in the third week of October next year, I would probably just want to know two things. Tell me what's going on in like Arizona, Wisconsin, and Nevada.
Absolutely.
And the second thing I want to know is what's the campaign about? Now, if this is a referendum on the Biden presidency, Trump's going to win.
Yep.
If this is a referendum on Trump, Biden's going to win. If this is a referendum of the Trump presidency versus the Biden presidency, Trump might win that.
He might.
And so the question is going to be, ultimately, what is the campaign about? Now, if you take, and I don't know for sure, but if you take that escalator ride down in 2015 that Trump made, since that escalator ride, he has been the dominant force field in American politics,
100%.
in which everything else revolves around. And I think that helps explain why AOC and Sanders said what they said the other day. And by the way, there was this conventional wisdom. Well, so go back to the primary. So primaries have this kind of chemical reaction that takes place that you never expect it, but it happens at some point. In 2020, there was a chemical reaction in the Democratic Party where there was like a 10-day period where it looked like if somebody didn't move and consolidate, Bernie Sanders is going to be the Democratic nominee.
100%.
So the chemical reaction was to go to Biden. And the theory of the case at the time was only Biden could beat Trump. Now, as it turned out, that was probably accurate because Biden, 44,000 people in 3 states have voted differently. Trump would have gotten reelected. I don't see anyone in that field back then that could have beaten Trump. Now,
I did a survey. I did a survey back early in 20. And if it had been Bernie, I think Trump would have won 44 states.
Yeah, if you did a redo in America politics today, based on everything we know today, Nixon would have beaten McGovern by more than what he won by in 72, and that was a landslide. So anyway, so the question is going to be, what's the campaign about? I suspect it's going to be about Trump, and I think the Trump support that is built in the primary through all of his travails, I think masks real vulnerability that he has in the general election. There's 20% of Republicans that don't like Trump. They were decisive.
My people.
Yeah. So 20% is a lot in a narrow election in a handful of states. It is why Democrats swept these 6 states I told you, they're the only states that matter. It's where the balance of power is. Democrats won all the governorships in those states with lots of support from Republicans. Mitch McConnell said after the 2022 midterms and why the Republicans lost the Senate, he said the first thing he said was it was Republican defectors. So I think there are, I think that what he's putting the country through is masking the fact that a majority of this country doesn't want to go back to crazy and worries about what this guy, if he wins, he knows what to do.
Sadly, that is true. He knows exactly what to do.
So the stakes couldn't be higher. But I wouldn't underestimate, particularly in those industrial states. And I thought when Bannon said this in 2016, he was crazy. He said, we're not worried about swing voters. We're worried about getting people out to vote who don't vote, who we know if they vote, they're going to support us. There are a lot of people, particularly in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, skewing older, white, male, non-college, who are outside the voting system. And so there is a lot of opportunity for Trump to pick up these voters if he can get them to vote. And the other thing is there are actually Biden 2020 voters who I think are open to Trump, which I never would have thought. Not a lot, but again,
I think you're right. I worry about that, and I will tell you one of the places Democrats should be thinking about that is with Hispanic men who are weirdly tweaking to the right. Well, not weirdly. They're doing it's a really long-term cultural sort of thing. But I think they should be keeping an eye on that and not presuming that African American men and Hispanic men are going to continue to behave as Democratic voters automatically.
Well, I think I agree with that, but I think a couple things here. First of all, Hispanics traditionally are conservative culturally,
right?
And secondly, I didn't say it, but underlying all my thinking about everything I've been talking about is the fact that I think education now is the great divider in American politics. You tell 100%. Me the education profile of a community, I'll tell you how they're going to vote.
How they vote, 100%.
And particularly with Hispanics, they aspire, and you saw this in the beginning of the middle of the last century with Irish and Italians and other immigrants coming here. The more that people assimilate in this country generationally, the less they identify with their ethnicity and more they identify with where they are in life. So Hispanics skew younger, and younger people think both parties suck. They skew more working class. And particularly in a place like Nevada, which has got Nevada is 44th in the level of education in this country. It's towards the bottom. It's one of the few states that are swing states that aren't in the middle in education levels. And you saw the voting for governor in Nevada in 2022 when they elected a Republican. You saw Trump's increase in vote in 2020 there. I think that Trump can be very formidable in Nevada, largely due to these working class Hispanics. I think African Americans are different. I think in the case there, there's not as much of a potential for support, but nevertheless, Trump has already made some inroads. But older African American voters are quite different than younger ones.
Right.
And you've seen the decline in the African American vote in urban areas now is pronounced in 2020. Put aside Cordell West as a third party. There's a real challenge and problem that Biden and Democrats are going to have in getting those people out to vote. And if you ask them how their life is now compared to 2 years ago, most of the time it's a lot worse.
That's right. That's right. Well, Doug Sosnik, I want to thank you so much for coming on the Enemies List today. That was a great interview, and I really appreciate your time. We look forward to having you back on the show as the election moves on, because we're going to be talking about it a lot. And
thank you.
Thanks again. All right. Hey, on the list today, the Enemies List features Republican mega donors. Why are Republican mega donors on the Enemies List today? Well, I will tell you why. The great frenzy among Republican money people right now is to flood the zone and get Glenn Youngkin and to get Glenn Youngkin in the race, the hero that will save America from Donald Trump. Listen, guys, I get it. You're all billionaires and multimillionaires, and really money doesn't matter to you at a certain level. This is sort of, play money for you at a certain level. But those of you who hate Trump, and most of you do, most of you hate Trump. I know it. I've talked to you people about it. I've talked to many of the people that have funded Ron DeSantis. I've talked to many of the people that will be funding this ridiculous Glenn Youngkin primary idea. And they all hate Trump. They hate him so much. They hate him aesthetically. They hate him culturally. They hate him politically. They hate his vulgarity. They hate the fact that he's a faker. They hate everything about him. But they're desperately afraid of losing their tax cuts or losing their oil and gas tax benefits and all this other stuff. Okay? But you guys need to understand something. The way to beat Trump is the general election. The way to beat Trump is in November of next year. You will not get what you want from a Nikki Haley or a Tim Scott, who is too busy with his Canadian girlfriend, who's not on social media. You've never met her. She's a supermodel. You will never get what you want out of these people. Glenn Youngkin is poison to MAGA voters when Trump is still in the race. Unless Trump is dead, a guy like Ron DeSantis or Glenn Youngkin is never going to be able to capture their hearts. So what you're going to do is go out and burn another, $500 million to the ground between now and the end of the primaries, trying to get Glenn Youngkin, Glenn fucking Youngkin. Come on, people. You're going to try to get a guy like Glenn Youngkin over the line with MAGA crazy people when Trump is in the mid to high 50s with Republican voters in most early primary states. I know you guys are rich, but I didn't think you were dumb. This is dumb money. This is bad, dumb money. Invest in GameStop if this is what you're going to do. Anyway, but until then, you're on the Enemies List.